Good day, duelists! Over on this channel, I often talk about good decks, good cards, best cards even of each civilization, but what if we went the other way around? Today, we are diving deep into the trenches of the Duel Masters TCG to uncover cards that make yourself ask, what the hell were they thinking? It's time to jump into the top 10 worst Duel Masters cards ever printed. Now let me tell you, overall Duel Masters did an amazing job balancing out the different cards, but even so, there are a lot of terrible cards in the game that could have been on this list, but the top 10 cut had to be made somewhere, so a lot of bad cards had to be left outside. A dishonorable mention goes to our legendary friend Scissorai, a 4-mana 3000 creature that does, well, nothing, and other creatures like it such as Skeleton Soldier the Defiled. Now Scissorai is obviously not a good card, but I decided not to include it on the list because A, well, it's just kinda boring to have it in there, but also B, I genuinely believe that the cards that I picked out might actually be even worse. So what could be worse than a 4-mana 3000 do nothing? Well, let's start out with number 10. But before I show you the actual card, let me show you this one. Seamine is a card released all the way back in base set. A 6-mana 4000 is arguably even worse than the 4-mana 3000 Scissorai from before, so the effect must be really good then, right? Well, not really, just a blocker. And while that's a decent effect, if you want a 4000 power blocker you can pay half the mana and get a Phantom Fish. For 6 mana you should be getting Grangur level stats. And yes, Seamine has the upside that it can attack, but it's awkward because to attack with it you must tap it, and then you can't block with it if it's tapped. Overall, Seamine is just a very underwhelming card even by base set standards. Now fast forward 4 sets later and in DM05 they decided to release Lurking Eel. That's right, our number 10 cards is so bad that I don't even own a copy. It's like Seamine, but even worse, as it can only block fire and nature creatures. You're paying 6 mana and all you're getting is a 4000 power wannabe half-fast blocker. It's insane, and we're only just getting started. Number 9. Stinger Ball. For 3 mana you would normally be getting a 3000 power creature, or you can sacrifice 1000 power and stick a draw 1 card effect on your creature, and then you can sacrifice 1000 more power to get a crazy good effect, which is, looking at one of your opponent's shields. Why would anyone play this? Especially since one set earlier, back in DM02, they released Windy Oracle, which has the same effect, but costs 1 less mana and it had 500 more power. But Wizards must have really thought that we liked Stinger Ball, because 4 sets later, all the way in DM07, they released Curious Eye, which is the same card. It's not even a different race like with Locomotiver and Gigabalza, it's actually just the same card. I don't know who in their right mind looked at Stinger Ball and went, we need more of that, but alas, at the very least it gets the consolation prize of securing a spot on this list. Number 8. Virtual Tripwire. 3 mana to tap one of your opponent's creatures. See, the thing is, ever since the beginning of the game, Light Civilization had this spell called Solar Ray, which not only does the same thing for 1 mana cheaper, but it's also a shield trigger, which for a card like this is huge, as the trigger ability could potentially stop an incoming attack. And Solar Ray is a decent card, it's not terrible, but it's by no means good, and yet it's infinitely better than Virtual Tripwire. I guess they wanted Water to have access to some tap, but make it clear that it's weaker than Light. But if you strip away the trigger from Solar Ray, it kills the card. If you make it 1 mana more expensive, it kills the card. If you do both at the same time, you end up with Virtual Tripwire. To add insult to injury, they later decided to release a card called Solar Trap, which has the same text as Virtual Tripwire, but for 1/3 of the cost. Now to be fair, it's still a spell that taps something, so like, you would never include this in your deck, but if this card somehow magically materialized in your hand during a duel, you might find yourself wanting to play it sometimes, which is why I decided to put it at number 8 and no higher. Number 7. Aqua Rider. A 4 mana 2000 that's even worse than Scissorai. What could its amazing effect be that warrants this horrendous stat line? Well, it's a blocker. Sort of. Only sometimes. For 4 mana in water you could be getting a 5000 power blocker, and yes, while Aqua Rider can attack, like we discussed with Lurking Eel at number 10, that's not that relevant for a blocker. And this one is not even a full-time blocker. It's only a blocker if your opponent summons or casts something, which is most of the time, but not always. If the opponent has a full board of creatures, they have the option to simply swing in without any summons and ignore this card completely. The best part as well is that this card was released in set 6, and all the way back in DM02, we had Aqua Shooter, which has the same stat line, same race, but unlike Aqua Rider, it is a full-time blocker. And Aqua Shooter wasn't even good back in DM02 times. Now, to be fair, Aqua Ranger at least has the upside that it avoids things like Critical Blade or Scarlet Sky Terror if they are the first thing played that turn, since it wouldn't be blocker yet by the time they are used, so it's technically not strictly worse than Aqua Shooter, but it's still a terrible, unplayable mess, which is why it made its way on this list. Number 6. Rise and Shine. Another card I apparently don't have in my collection. I should really buy some bad cards as well. It's Rise and Shine. It allows you to look at the top 4 cards of your deck, pick a blocker among them, and add it to your hand. Now, on the surface that doesn't sound too terrible, until you realize that 2 sets before this card was released they gave us Submarine Project, which is similar, but it costs 1 less mana, it can pick out any card, not just blockers, and it's just water, not water light. And remember, dual civ cards are supposed to be at a premium in terms of power, since they require twice as many colors to cast. So this 4 mana spell is strictly worse in 3 different ways than a card that was released 2 sets earlier and isn't even that good. But forget Submarine Project if you're willing to go up to 4 mana for Rise and Shine. There's Crystal Memory. This allows you to look at your entire deck, not just the top 4 cards, and take any card instead of being restricted to blockers, and once again, it's not a dual civ. And Crystal Memory was released all the way back in base set. What the hell were they thinking when they printed Rise and Shine? I guess at the very least in a blocker-centric deck it's still a draw 1 card spell? As horrible as it is, I could see it being used in draft or a cube or something in the absence of something else, which is why I didn't put it any higher than number 6. Number 5. Mystic Inscription. The first non-water card on this list, will you look at that? Boy did they overrate shield gain back then, huh? 6 mana to get 1 shield is just insane. Especially since we had cards like Sundrop Armor or Mana Nexus that could generate a shield for 4 mana, and you got to pick which shield you put, unlike Mystic Inscription, which gives you a random one. And Mana Nexus was even a shield trigger. But even those 2 spells were made obsolete later on in the game's life by cards like Skysword, the Savage Vizier. I mean, just look at these 2 side by side. This one costs 1 less mana, comes with a 2000 power body, and also ramps you up in mana. It's not even close. If Mystic Inscription was a shield trigger, it would still be bad, but at least it would have some redeeming quality about it. But like this, it's nothing more than just a terrible card. Number 4. Marine Scramble. That's right, we're right back to the water civilization with this one. I swear I don't hate water, I don't have a personal agenda against it, it just so happens that it hosts a whole bunch of horrible cards. I mean, look at this one. It reads your creatures can be blocked this turn, which is not a bad effect, but 7 fucking mana! I mean, god damn! It's such a narrow effect. The stars need to align where you have a board full of creatures, your opponent is playing a blocker-centric deck, they have a board full of creatures, and even then 7 mana is just way too much for this. I mean, just play Holy Awe instead. It accomplishes the same thing but also has a billion other use cases. Or if you want to stick to water and deal with blockers, just play Crystal Paladin or hell, even Crystal Lancer instead. Marine Scramble is just a ridiculously expensive, unwieldy, and narrow, pathetic excuse for a finisher. Before I show you the number 3 pick, let me show you 2 cards that came out in DM03. Miyar Comet Elemental and Giriel Ghastly Warrior. 8 mana boss creatures that have 11,000 and 11,500 power respectively. The thing about these 2 is, they're not great. In general, big expensive meatballs that do nothing on board are not all that viable. Imagine investing 8 mana and your entire turn into this big body, only for it to get Death Smoked for 4 mana, or Coral or Terror Pit or Spirogate, etc. So even back in DM03 times, these 2 were not played in good decks, but at least they were cool, they were the biggest creatures released to that date. But then 7 sets later, in DM10, arguably the strongest and most impactful set in Duel Masters history, they printed Gyawarazar Dragon, an 11,000 power meatball just like these two, but it costs 1 more mana. These two were not good enough to be played back in DM03, they were definitely not good enough for DM10 days, and for some inexplicable reason they decided to reprint them in Fire, but 1 mana more expensive. And to add insult to injury, it's a very rare. So if you're opening a DM10 booster pack, in your very rare slot you could have either Bombazar, Dragon of Destiny, the holy grail of English Duel Masters, or you could have this steaming piece of shit and be endlessly disappointed. Number 2. Raza Vega, Thunder Guardian. See, the effect of this creature is actually not all that bad. It's a 3000 power blocker that goes back to your shields when it's destroyed. These effects work well together as both act towards the goal of stopping attacks and stalling the game. But 10 mana? 10 fucking mana! I mean, shit, for 10 mana a card better outright win you the game when it's played, but instead you get a 3000 power blocker? For 10 mana you get a Sarius? And yes, the Sarius does go back to shields to help you stall the game further, but first of all your opponent probably leaves it in there and doesn't break it again until they can just kill you. But more importantly, what are you stalling towards? At 10 mana, it's the end of the game already. You've already stalled to this point, it's time to play your win conditions. This card's design is just paradoxical. They make a card that's good at stalling games and stopping aggression, but they make it 10 mana, by which point aggression is already way past its prime. If you've made it to turn 10 against an aggro deck, you've probably already won. Raza Vega makes absolutely no sense, and it's a shame because, I mean, just look at it, it's so damn cute. Fortunately for this little guy, there is one card that I just had to put above it. Finally, at number 1, we have Aqua Master. For 6 mana, you would expect a creature to have about 7000 power. Aqua Master is sitting at almost half that at 4000, so its effect must be really good then, right? Well, remember Win the Oracle from before, released all the way back in DM02? Win allowed you to look at your opponent's shields every time it attacks, and it traded 500 power of the normal expected stat line to do so. Well, Aqua Master trades 3000 power for the same effect. Except, wait, it's not the same effect, it's even worse. Because it needs to not be blocked to activate it, while Win suffers no such restrictions, and also the shield stays face up, so your opponent also gets the information, whereas with Win the Oracle only you knew what was in there. So to recap, you take an effect that's worth 500 power, you make it worse in 2 different ways, you make your creature 3000 power weaker for it, and you end up with Aqua Master. What an incredible waste of a cool artwork. As per usual, when looking at this card, we're left asking, what in the world were they thinking? As a closing fun fact, for this card in particular, we actually do know what they were thinking. According to a tweet by Masami Ibamoto, they wanted to make Aqua Master do something unique. Initially, that was supposed to be getting an extra turn, but ultimately decided to move that ability to Balas Baj, and Aqua Master was given the admittedly never before printed effect of flipping a shield face up. So in conclusion, Aqua Master might very well be the worst card in the Duel Masters TCG. I mean, I'd honestly rather play Scissorai over it, but at the very least it has a nice backstory behind it. So to recap in order from bad to worse, we have Lurking Eel, Stinger Ball, Virtual Tripwire, Aqua Rider, Rise and Shine, Mystic Inscription, Marine Scramble, Gyawarazar Dragon, Raza Vega, and finally Aqua Master. So do you agree with my picks? Are there other terrible cards that you would have liked to see here? Leave a comment below and let me know. I can't wait to hear what you all think. That's all for now, duelists. See ya and take care.